Sup everybody, this is Karak with ACG, and today I come to you dirty, damaged, and delighted to see the dawn as I bring to you a no-spoiler review for Dark Souls 3, which is, as always, made by From Software. So bring out your dead, grab your fume greatsword, and let's do this. In Dark Souls 3, you begin the hunt for the appropriately scarily named Lords of Cinder, and in the end, look to put an end to the cycle of fire and dark that's plagued the land. But who are you, and why are you doing it? That's the question here. Well, actually, another question is probably, why are all these evil monsters just hanging out to be killed by the next dude who comes sword spinning by? But we'll get to that. Let's check it out and see if this game is as good as the prior titles. As always, if you like the video, maybe subscribe. So here's the review for Dark Souls 3. Somersaulting in full plate mail, smashing demonic tree ball sacks, and the world's scariest rope bridge. And graphics are up first. Really, there are times of grandeur that are few and far between in video games, and it's a testament to the Dark Souls series that many exist within these titles, and yet in some ways, DS3 is the leanest of the series so far. Walking across the crumbling battlements of a castle of questionable structural capacity, you're greeted with some of the most grandiose and stunning scenery since, well, Dark Souls 1, 2, and Bloodborne. Indeed, while the polish is high here, I never could quite shake the feeling that I had somehow been invited into the Gothic Travel Roadshow, now without commercial breaks. Hey, here's a swamp, hey, here's a mountain, and hey, here's a castle. There's something slight but noticeably samey in these locations this time that works both from a great position of familiarity, but also just a little bit of disappointment that the wings weren't stretched as much as previous titles. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't look gorgeous, it does. In fact, I challenge anybody to enter the profane capital or the Boreal Valley, and it will be impossible to not be impressed with the detail and the texture work and geometry, but also in that twisted artistic representation that the developers continue to employ. A trek through the undead settlements and its subtle but twisting verticality and meeting pathways, and you're bound to just be a little bit reminded of what it must have been like to live in the Dark Age villages that were also ravaged by demons and dudes carrying giant saw blades. Of course, the big plus here is that battle is also impacted by all this design. And let's speak of enemies for a second. While we do have some general returning foes, I personally think that Dark Souls 3 enemies are the most enjoyable of all the series. From the Dark Mass, who are infected undead who basically alter beast themselves into something that looks like it belongs in a Todd McFarlane comic, to the massive-eyed basilisk botflies that inhabit the swamp, almost too cute to kill, but not really, and of course returning from previous titles. While I didn't feel that the horror aspect was as high in Dark Souls 3 Ancient Architecture, it felt like the overall artistic representation of a solidified world was actually higher here, and things fit where they were, though at times you may still chuckle at a bunch of dudes apparently guarding a plain wall. In the end, it's the overall theme that attracts fans. Excellent textures, animation, and placement work. Now, all that being said, it's not perfect in the land of dark swamps, and I say that because the swamp area hit frame rate unrealistically hard, going from an average 60 frames per second on a 980 GTX at 1080p to 12 and maybe 18 in the swamps. It was terrible, and strangely enough, nothing could be done. Switching around the options resulted in a few FPS here or there. But really, that level's heavy use of reflections, alpha particles, transparencies, and draw distance killed frame rate like nothing else, making that location an absolute pain to experience in all ways. Very sad, and that level needs fixing ASAP. Luckily, getting through it was one of the shortest routes in the game, so that's a plus, but I would have liked to experience that area more. And of course, when it comes to options, textures, shadows, that kind of thing will be your heaviest hitters when it comes to trying to regain some frame rate. Now, altogether, I would say Dark Souls 3 nails the look. I'm a bit saddened we don't see a couple more unique locations, even if the ones shown are outstanding. For newcomers, they won't notice this at all, and I doubt anyone can lay eyes on the same mammoth views that I saw and not be momentarily impressed, at least with the scale. Sound, music, and voice.
If, like the others, you're fool enough to play the champion, then go on ahead. Traipse right past the abandoned church.
And of course, sound is up first here. Whether dancing past the deadly flames of Drake that just surprise barbecued his own allies, apparently because he thinks it's hilarious, to mixing it up with an assortment of scarecrow-looking dudes in an undead settlement, or fighting off some chick who's been eating all of her co-workers. The sounds in battle are good, though there is sadly a bit of mud, especially as many of the weapons inhabit the exact same location in the sound spectrum and don't have much variation to speak of in swing tone. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it means that during tense battles, unless there's some range separation from you and the enemies, it can be difficult picking up where bad guy who wants to eat you number 1 is compared to bad guy who wants to eat you number 2 is. Additionally, the sound work in some sonically close locations needs serious work, with both echo and reverb at times thrashing your ears with gratingly tinny and unpleasant effects added onto the sounds. Strangely enough, other locations like the sewers have an excellent long stretch to their sounds, with weapons and enemy screams extending perfectly and affected, of course, by wall proximity and direction. Altogether, I'd say it's a mixed bag. Good, but there are some problems here and there in some locations. Music. Listen, I'm not saying it's the best soundtrack of the Dark Souls games, but, well, yeah, for me it's the best soundtrack of the Dark Souls games. From the Abyss Watcher's main theme and its love for church bells and discordant vocal mixes to the hey, let's rent all the string section main theme. I love the music. Far less ambient, though, than some of the other titles. This is going to be hit and miss. But for the supposed end of the cycle title, I can do with some bombastic feeling here, and it's all over in spades, actually. Now, that also means there's less negative space within the musical tracks, which means, for me at least, a bit less tension than past soundtracks. But when it's going full tilt, and though it's not Excalibur with pounding horses cresting a mountain, there are a few times which, when I was coming over a hill and seeing a swarm of bad guys blocking me from my next bonfire respite, I felt all the vibes of being that dark hero. But I think a lot of people's mileage is going to vary when it comes to this music. And of course, that brings us to voice. While the Dark Souls games have never been ones to pontificate for too long, the voices here are done well in that same whispered, almost dead-to-the-world delivery that we've seen in prior titles. This is an emotionalist pit of despair, so there are very few voices in the way of excitement or brash delivery. In fact, there's one character that just grunts. Instead, everyone you meet delivers their lines with the subtle atmosphere of mystery and a good deal of just up and giving no shits in the plight of the situation. I liked it. It's not amazing, but it fits within the atmosphere and it worked well. And now the big dog, gameplay. As with all Dark Souls games, the design mastery here is within the making of a character that can interact with the mystery of the game world and allow you to experience it in a fashion that brings the most enjoyment, despite sometimes brutal requirements. Let's see how it did. First, as with all these games, it sort of starts with you creating a character, picking from an assortment of classes that really identify with particular stats at the very starting, and quickly escalates to exploring dangerous lands with mysterious monsters and interesting enemies, and then fighting bosses that makes most other games look shallow in comparison. When making characters, it's always interesting to note that the title continues the admirable trait of both making it clear what a stat does, but also somehow leaving a bit of mystery about its end result in the entire makeup of exploration and battle. For me, it's that tit-for-tat, that push-pull kind of end result that makes leveling up your spirit of unrighteous vengeance so fun for some people, and, of course, absolutely mystifying for others. Now, strength builds and dexterity builds will always have their place, but the true enjoyment, at least for me, in these kind of titles, is many times having characters that are a bit off and unique. Once you've chosen your character, named them, and started your game, you're thrown smack dab into the action with a nice, somewhat detailed tutorial on what to do, but there's still a lot of mystery here. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, so I'm going to answer this right off. While not having the interconnectedness of Dark Souls 1 with its hundreds of overlapping paths and mystifying cutbacks, Dark Souls 3 is less linear than Dark Souls 2. With some locations meaning back on others for an easier egress at a later time. It's enjoyable, but not the masterpiece of the original title. So as I jump into combat, I want to explain something. It's important to understand that combat within this title is speedier, and certainly the ability of some enemies to close distance is faster than past titles. It's not Bloodborne fast, well, maybe some of them are, but some are easily in that range at least, so be prepared for a bit of a change-up. Now, while the core gameplay within Dark Souls has not really changed, there has been some much-needed additions, like battle skills, which not only changes up the combat, but in my own opinion, absolutely raises the combat of Dark Souls 2 to a whole other level. Connected to the weapons wielded, battle skills allow for special moves to be pulled off depending on the weapon, your stats, and some various other factors. While some are basic, like the ability to smash through an enemy's shield and do direct damage regardless, others are connected to named weapons. This does the game two services. One, it makes normal weapons much more enjoyable to use, and as a fan of the butcher knife and machete, I can tell you that being able to sharpen them for more damage or lash out with a quick step, sliding behind foes, and being able to backstab them really elevates the combat. Also, these aren't instantaneous use, and they steal away focus points, resulting in this great deal of strategy as you now not only have to decide if you want to, hey, maybe heal, but instead maybe you want to try to take the enemy out with a powerful move, knowing that every move in the game takes different timing and requirements. Now, weapons and armor themselves, of course, can be infused with fire, poison, and an assortment of other effects. This stops them from scaling up, though, with their requisite attributes, and that's important to understand. It's a nice trade-off, as you can infuse them and remove it later, getting a good solid weapon right at the start, and then later, an even more powerful one. Ultimately disappointing, of course, is that some can't be infused, like bows, crossbows, staves, and others, which to me is a massive disservice to that build type, and really, I could not find any reason why that wasn't done. You can also reinforce weapons to add huge benefits to their damage as long as you have the right resources. As always, a good deal of the game is going to revolve around upgrading, and therefore some grinding. You don't have to, but to get the items to perform upgrades, some have fairly small drop chances, which can result in an undue amount of time spent in the same place farming the enemies MMO style as you continually reset the location by resting at bonfires. This upgrading and grinding is continued with covenants and their requirements, which are both online and NPC-driven groups that offer leveled rewards for going up in ranks, but can also require an extraordinary amount of grinding to do so. Covenants control some online aspects as well, like summoning help when you're being invaded online. Of course, for me, right now, multiplayer is sort of a mixed bag. While it has dedicated servers, 4-player co-op, and password matching, it also has the same issues that you would expect, which is everyone carrying around the Fume Greatsword, as it's not only pretty much a howitzer in blade form, but it's so much better than most other items, it looks hilarious when every single person you see is going to be using it. Let's talk about bosses. Of course, you have the bosses, which there are more than 15 in this game, and of course the mini bosses you're going to run into during normal gameplay. Boss battles are the crux of Demon Souls, rewarding gameplay, letting you identify and use the skills that you picked up in the levels prior and attempt to take these big baddies down. Here, though, I'm a little bit split. While some bosses are incredibly interesting to fight, and many are more engaging with multiple forms and requirements for defeat, there are also a good number of spamming bosses that really surprised me and drug down the experience. This is spoiler-free, so I won't drop bosses' names, but I will say that while some required finesse and switching from offensive to defensive with form changes, and even sometimes within the same form, others were quite literally spam attack button and roll. That being said, I love their designs regardless. Now, not all things are excellent in the world of Fire and Ash. There are a couple issues here. There's a good deal in need of rebalancing, and that's for sure. For one, Magic hasn't seemed to take the step forward in speed that much of the game has, and you always feel a half moment off compared to the new, slightly speedier enemies. This results in Magic still being useful, but I can see a lot of frustration already building around that design decision to not step some of that speed up, as well as faith. I think we can expect a good deal of rebalancing there, both in damage and speed of delivery. One thing to remember is, just like the past games and Bloodborne, not every build really is successful, but the difference between a game's flexibility and design and outright needing some touch-ups is a subtle one at best. Here, however, I think most are going to agree that entire swaths of gameplay styles shouldn't be as difficult as we are seeing expert gamers start to report. Magic is currently being lambasted for its uselessness at this time, so be prepared. I found it about 5 times as hard as a normal strength and dex build to get by. And that brings us to fun factor. For the most part, I had a very good time. I'm not going to lie, some of the boss runs from a bonfire to a retry can feel Lance Armstrongish at the very least, with you crossing the same locations countless times and the frustration that being attacked and slowed down can bring. That being said, I think I like Dark Souls 3 world design the best. It's not as complex as the original, nor as seemingly straightforward as the second. In fact, it's a demonic Goldilocks right in the middle, where the bed is probably made of past live skeletons and probably a broken controller or 3. While combat itself is somewhat unchanged, the addition of skills absolutely raised the bar here and was something that was missing that I didn't even know was missing. Loved it. So as always, I rate games on a buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it rating scale. As always, when I say rent, that means deep sale if you're on the PC. This is a buy, but with some caveats. If you're a Dark Souls fan, it's a solid title and possible closure to the series. Offers extensions to the original gameplay, brings new and old enemies back to the battle, and of course there are hours of Dark Souls lore hidden everywhere and some awesome boss battles. For newcomers, it can be a confusing combination of stats that don't seem to make a difference and brutal lethality. Dark Souls 3 Editions doesn't make this game suddenly easier with the battle skills, but with solid practice and maybe some time spent just beating up lower level enemies to understand the premise, I can see newcomers finding a good deal enjoyable here. Do you need to play the previous titles to enjoy 3? No, but it would allow the story to make some more sense, and that's saying something as many people who've played all 3 still don't understand the story. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, maybe check out the Reddit or Patreon. If you dislike the video, give it a thumbs down, and as always, peace out.
Oh, then it's true. A champion of Ash as I live and breathe. To be in your presence is a great honor.